part of a research team for an organization called From Alice to Abolitionists that did an annual audit of Denver's sweeps, assesses their effectiveness and assess the resources that were going into those, and released a series of reports about them, as well as producing 2 documentaries about them, and I currently serve as Housing Justice Committee Chair for the WBSA. So the camping ban is a policy that's being pushed right now in response to the homelessness crisis in Aurora. This is a pretty typical policy, and in fact, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is unfortunately become pretty standard policy among most American cities over the past couple of decades, and people are worried about what the impact is going to be, justifiably. But in a lot of ways, unfortunately, it's actually not going to change very much, because I can tell you actually that Aurora already performs sweeps, and they have for years. So what is a sweep? What are we talking about? When we're talking about sweeps, we are talking about mass forced displacements of people living in encampments on the street, utilizing various laws around public space, right? So because homeless people are, by definition, living in public, that means laws around public space can be utilized to regulate their behavior and to move them around, right? And so these policies typically involve mass displacement, again, so moving people from place to place. And it's sort of a common misconception that they're solely oriented around camping bans, but actually they can take a number of different forms based on the laws that they're enforcing, right? So camping bans are a typical example. These are laws that prohibit survival, essentially, right? Using methods of covering yourself or sheltering yourself while you're on the street. There are also other types of laws that aren't necessarily specifically related to homelessness, but are used to displace people in relation to living in encampments. So actually the most common type of sweep is what's called an encumbrance sweep. This relates to there's an ordinance prohibiting obstruction of the public right-of-way, which means essentially you can't block travel through public space, and this is used against people living in encampments, basically to argue that, you know, by virtue of living in public space, that their tent is blocking progress, and then they can section off an area to force people to move. There are also public health area restrictions is another common type, basically in response to public health conditions in encampments, right, sanitation conditions and things like that. The public health department has the authority to essentially enclose an area and then move everyone out of it while they go into whatever the source of a health hazard is, which is intended as an emergency response to things like if there's a gas leak, if there's a chemical leak, if there's sewage backup, something like that. They need to be able to go in and keep people out of that area, right? But in the case of a homeless encampment sweep, that means they're essentially declaring an entire neighborhood as a hazard area and using that in order to displace an entire encampment, right? So all of these laws, you may have noticed, are not necessarily very closely related. They're very distinct legally. And in fact, this is because most of these things are a sort of formalization of pre-existing practices. And the encampment sweeps have changed in terms of their legal justification and in terms of their regulations over the course of the years. But essentially, the basic practice has remained the same. This comes out of old vagrancy laws and even just informal practices of essentially sort of shooing the homeless out of town, right? And so the way that these function in the modern day is, of course, a little more regulated and a little more structured, but it's essentially still displacing people continuously around the city. And so based on these different types of sweeps, these are performed by different agencies, but typically, the different groups involved in these are primarily the police department, right? So this is APD for Aurora, as well as the Department of Transportation. In Aurora, actually, it's primarily the state agencies that are enforcing these. In Denver, we have the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. Here it's mostly CDOT. Though Aurora also recently has signed an agreement, your Public Works Department has with CDOT to be reimbursed for sweeps that they will not perform, and instead the Public Works Department will be taking on more of those. This is actually pretty typical. And then of course there is the Public Health Department as well. So these are really broadly multi-agency policies adopted by a sort of coalition of different parts of the state and local governments. This has a number of different effects. First of all, it requires a lot of bureaucracy, right? Which means also it can be hard to keep track of the data of how these things are performing and what they're doing. It also means that they are in a lot of ways very resistant to reform or regulations, right? Because it's a lot of different departments working together on these things, and it's not sufficient to necessarily change any one law if you want to change this process, because again, those laws are essentially justifications for the thing that they're already doing, right? So what is the impact of all this? First of all, life disruption is one of the most significant ones. By forcing people to constantly be on the move, this means that they have to expend a lot of energy constantly to move, right? I mean, if you've ever moved your house, you could understand it's a difficult process, requires a lot of work. And so this means they're taking up a lot of their time simply to be constantly moving around. More significantly, this also changes the makeup of encampments that we see, right? So people who are consistently displaced by sweeps can become more isolated. Actually, studies in Denver, about 6 months after the camping ban, we did a large study of over 500 people experiencing homelessness, and it showed that about 66% of them moved to more isolated, more secluded, more dangerous areas. And actually, we know that statistically for such people, they have increased risk of things like death of exposure, frostbite, things like sexual assault, overdose, basically anything where you would need help from another person if you're in that situation, right? Those rates are increased, and so a lot of people become more isolated, and therefore they become more vulnerable to those things. Actually, Denver saw a huge increase in crime against the homeless after the passing of the urban camping ban. It went up by 49% over about 5 years. And this causes a number of different public health risks, as well as you can imagine. But for people trying to avoid those kinds of isolation factors and trying to prevent, trying to look out for their own safety, a lot of the time the safest route is to stick together, right? So this also results typically in encampments consolidating and growing into what we sometimes call mega camps. Particularly as a lot of time, depending on the type of sweep, this is I think more common in Denver than in Aurora, but sometimes the city will also deploy what's called hostile architecture, which is essentially where they block off the area where people have been camping, or in other ways prevent people from moving through that area or living there. And so this essentially encloses and reduces the amount of space available for people to live in, and at the same time forces them together into these growing encampments, which has a number of public health risks for people living in them, actually. Trash accumulates, infectious diseases spread rapidly, rodents proliferate, things like that. So this predictably results in health conditions in encampments typically worsening. So this is probably the main way to mitigate these effects, is through things like trash service or public restrooms. But actually, cities typically refuse to provide these at encampments because they consider it to be encouraging that type of behavior of being homeless. And so the city actually tends to exacerbate these problems. I don't know this condition in Aurora, but in Denver, there's an extreme lack of bathrooms and trash service in public, which actually results in common complaints and harassment of public-facing service employees for people who are unable to access restrooms and things like that. The other thing that constantly moving around will do is it can disconnect people from service providers as well as from community, right? They're from their friends and from mutual aid networks, things like that. Because you have to understand a lot of the people don't have phones or computers, and even if they do, they don't have access to electricity to keep them charged. So essentially, they're relying on being able to move to a place and have in-person interaction with them in order to communicate. So when people are constantly moving around, this can often break off contact between people living in encampments and the people trying to help them, right? Service providers pretty routinely report this kind of disconnection. Actually, it's become a real problem if you're a caseworker, for instance, and you might simply lose your client, literally physically lose them in the city. And so we tend to see lower numbers of homeless people accessing services as a result of these displacements as well. The other thing that it does is takes away people's stuff. So one of the typical results of these is property loss, because a typical policy is that unattended property isn't necessarily stored, so if somebody isn't at the encampment at the time that a sweep is performed, that means that they lose everything they own. Actually, your representative has taken steps to ensure that this isn't the case with the camping ban that's being passed right now, and has modeled storage requirements based off of what we achieved in Denver by a lawsuit. This is a way of keeping people with the tools that they need to survive, right? If their tent is taken away, that's their shelter. And actually, we've seen because of this things like amputations due to frostbite and deaths of exposure. Those rates went up significantly after the passing of the urban camping ban by over 300%, actually. And we know that this is pretty prevalent for a lot of reasons. Even people who are at the site of the sweep, at the time of the sweep, they might not have the time and energy to move all of their stuff from one place to another place, and they might lose property in the process. Sweeps also just tend to be socially a very chaotic environment, right? So there's a lot of, things might get stolen in that process or accidentally thrown away. So actually, a survey's shown that over 80% of people have lost property in sweeps, and about 29% of them have lost everything that they owned. So this is a significant loss for people living on the street. So why do we do this, right? Why do cities use these policies? I would understand sweeps primarily as essentially the fist of gentrification, right? This is part of a process in which redevelopment of areas is being facilitated, because the first thing you have to understand is that homeless people cause a number of issues that are sort of frowned upon, shall we say, by real estate developers in particular, and also city agencies that are trying to redevelop areas. They can lower property values, they can increase the crime rate, no, not because they are all criminal scum, but because, as we've just discussed, by definition, many aspects of their life are inherently criminalized, so they inherently raise the crime rate simply by existing in an area. And this has impacts on real estate development, has impacts on people wanting to live or work in an area. And so when an area is being gentrified, typically we see the acceleration of sweeps. We saw this in Denver over the past couple of years. They sped up in anticipation of large tourist attractions such as the MLB All-Star Game, and the rate of displacement in Aurora has accelerated along with gentrification as well. And so this really is an attempt to force these people into the shelter system, essentially, or into the jail system. Basically, criminalization relies on trying to put people into these positions where they can be more effectively controlled, regulated, and exploited, because people living on the street obviously are often labeled as what's called service resistant, right? They don't necessarily want to be forced into these conditions where they are living in this place where they essentially have very little agency or control over their life. And so a lot of people are unwilling to put themselves in those situations. This is an attempt basically to push them into those places, which then takes them out of the public eye and keeps them out of the public right of way, which frees that up for development. Again, if it's not clear, all of this has a really dramatic impact on the lives of those people, though, and the result is an overwhelming amount of human misery and death, frankly. And so this is essentially about putting the needs of these developments in large part over the survival needs of homeless people. So what can you do about this? What can we do to change this situation? Well, the first thing that I would suggest as individuals is just to ask, right? To develop relationships with your neighbors experiencing homelessness and build connections with them. Again, a lot of the thing that sweeps do to them is they disrupt connections with the surrounding community. So by building those connections, you can help your neighbors survive and can help them hopefully get off the street and into housing. Because it's really, really hard to do those things while you're living on the street, and those conditions are consistently being worsened by things like sweeps. Know the law is another thing I would suggest. Again, like there's a whole host of these policies. As this camping ban is being passed, we're seeing it be formulated in this way that's in response to some of the ways in which camping bans in other cities were considered unconstitutional or otherwise sort of legally vulnerable. So learning the specifics of the law, of what the city can and can't get away with, so to speak, and of what, where and when is or isn't safe for a person to exist in the surrounding environment, right, can help you give them guidelines and can help you hold the city to what they're actually supposed to be doing, as opposed to these sorts of informal policies that, again, can disrupt people's lives. The other thing that you can do is try to change these policies, right? Support politicians that support the policies you want to see, and that recognize that homelessness ends with housing, and talk to your representatives. Ultimately, as we're seeing now, right, this stuff changes through city council and it's developed at that level. So talk to your city councilors.
Thanks, Wren.
Any questions? Yes.
I have a few questions and comments.
Okay.
Aurora stopped the Aurora Warms the Night program, and Aurora Mental Health has recorded many, not many, but they have had losses of human lives because they stopped that program.
Which program is it?
The Aurora Warms the Night program,
Uh-huh.
and there have been lives that were lost because that program was stopped.
Right.
And I have asked this question and I have not had clear answers on it as to if this goes forward. There are families that are in these camps. They live in cars. What happens to the children? And if the fines are imposed, is it per person? Is it and are the children fined? And if they go to jail, that increases the jail capacity.
Absolutely.
So are we expanding the Aurora jail? And
These might be questions.
do the children go to jail? So, and we also, some of them have pets.
Absolutely.
Do the pets go to the shelter for adoption? What happens to the pets?
I mean, these are all logistical questions. They're very important questions
And
about
they are because
implementation.
they're family, and some of them are of situations of domestic violence.
Absolutely. It's one of the most common reasons people end up on the street.
So what happens?
Alan, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. So the thing is, we don't have any of that developed at this point. So it's a big question mark about how this is going to be implemented. I've already shared that I don't think they work. I don't fundamentally agree that's how you treat people, and it doesn't solve the root problems. But to your point, it does create situations where you might incur a financial fee or jail time as a result of that interaction, right? So I think that's a great question. I don't have the answer to, because the way that it's been talked about is that, oh, that's not going to happen. I think the data shows kind of otherwise. Again, why I'm not a fan, another concern of mine is, I know some of you all have talked to me about some safety concerns in your particular neighborhoods, right? We want to talk to our police department, or working with our police department to address other pressing needs in the community. And what I'm concerned with is that we're going to be diverting our police that we're already having some staffing issues with on a nationwide level, and certainly in Aurora. We're going to literally divert their time, energy, and attention away from enforcing other laws or prioritizing other needs to enforce this camping ban. So that's a concern that I have, on top of the fact that, so to your point, I spoke to our public defender's office, and one of the common charges people get is trespassing. So if it's not a camping ban charge, right, it just morphs, right? The charge that you get is something different. So.
Well, and I can say too, probably one of the most common results of these is that even if there isn't the fine attached to these kinds of citations, if people get a ticket as a result of a camping ban or something like that, frequently they wind up with a charge for failure to appear, because they have no way necessarily to get to the court, to show up to their court date, and so then they wind up being incarcerated as a result of that.
So So, yes, thank you. And I know, Ellen, you had some more nuance, but the short answer is I don't have all the answers because we haven't thought that through. I think it's, like, if you were at the state legislature, in order to pass a law, you would need a fiscal note, right? You would need the financial impact to have that, like, conversation. Nope, we're there. I think it's gonna pass, and we still don't have an idea. There hasn't been a conversation of the tax dollars, your guys' tax dollars that's gonna be put to implement this camping ban. And I would pose the question, right, what's the opportunity cost? The money that's going to go to enforcing this camping ban, or the money we could have been proactively spending to create more housing. And I say all of this, for those of you who don't know, in 2020, so I spent my first 4 years pushing for the creation of our first ever strategic housing plan. We've had, some things in housing here and there, but it was never like a plan to address different types of housing, different incomes, different areas that we might develop in. And part of those recommendations allowed the city to come up with some innovative solutions. So we have safe overnight parking as a result of that plan. We have pallet shelters, which are, and we do have some tents, so safe tents, safe supervised, like tent sites, camping sites for folks where they can get connected to services. And the success rate that our city has in those areas is tremendous compared to what you would see as a result of like just isolating and moving people around. So we were on the beginnings of doing all of that. Mind you, all of that was created before anyone ever knew there was a global pandemic, right? So that kind of made things worse. Like there's just no way around that. I know everyone's like, oh, COVID this and it's the fault of that, but quite legitimately, people were displaced. People lost their jobs en masse, right? So I think that we have to kind of acknowledge that. So definitely, they're full. Those safe alternatives, and these are alternatives for folks who might have families who don't want to go to a congregate shelter. These are options for people who have pets their pets aren't necessarily allowed in a shelter, right? So these were creative options that we were starting to implement, but we haven't had time to really address the full amount of need. In addition to, I totally lost my train of thought. But the point being is that so last year, and again, I don't know where you all are coming from. I don't want to assume that I know how you're feeling about this. I have heard from folks when there are issues. I'll get to you in a second. I have heard that folks have issues with, kind of the visual aspects, right? Maybe there are some people who are hostile, right? So I don't want to minimize how you're feeling, how you might have engaged with folks. But again, we haven't even had the opportunity to see data-driven solutions and their success, because the camping ban conversation came about, and it sounds like the solution, right? I can empathize with well, if you don't want it, then you just make it go away. But these are people, right? We know that it is very complicated. People's lives are changed drastically. But in addition to that, when I spoke to our city staff about, hey, what are some of the issues we were experiencing in trying to address homelessness, right? One of the issues is that at one point we had 3 times the volume of just complaints, not necessarily people experiencing homelessness, but 3 times the volume of complaints is what we were experiencing. So, but we didn't have 3 times the amount of staff. So do you see how that math doesn't really work out with people's current job? They had to add a whole nother job when they didn't really have the resources to do that. So luckily I was able to talk with our city manager. He incorporated a whole new position, a full-time employee, to be able to get through the volume so that we could, folks were not, responses weren't being had at one point because we couldn't even get to it, right? But that was going to address the issue. It was going to streamline our internal processes, all that good stuff, right? But that person has only been hired for 2 months, 3 months. So no way is that going to be addressed within that time frame. But here we are having the conversation around the camping ban. So I'll tell you, those were kind of the other ways in which we were trying to proactively address housing and homelessness, and develop relationships and support our providers who do this, who we contract with, to build relationships, to move people to permanent supportive housing. So that's kind of the context, like not just in the camping ban, but some of the decisions that we've been making over the past couple of years to try to address this. Before I get to you, Nolan, there was a question over here.
Yeah, so are you suggesting that housing is 100% of the solution here? Or are you suggesting that there are multiple issues involved here and not just housing? And if it is predominantly housing, what percentage of the population as we currently collected would be willing to and get to housing if it was available?
Right.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the solution that we found that works based on the data is they actually did a huge study in Denver called the Social Impact Bond that took place over 10 years that sort of studied this. The typical model that we work with is housing first, but it's specifically supportive housing, right? So what this means is you take people off the street, you put them into housing, right? And then that housing then becomes a basis as a place where you can provide services to those people, right? So the thing that the situation that a lot of these people are living in is that they have wound up homeless for whatever reasons, right? Whether that's life difficulties or mostly economic circumstances, and then once they're on the street, they're in a traumatic situation, right? So they're being traumatized repeatedly, which can exacerbate issues with mental illness or drug addiction that already exist, or even that don't, causing them because again they're in this situation that is incredibly difficult to cope with, and that creates this sort of vicious cycle, right, where it becomes almost impossible to get off the street because of these issues being exacerbated, and because again due to the constant displacement with the sweeps, they have no way really to access these services to get them off the streets. So the way that we deal with again, the end result is a constellation of problems, right? And you have to deal with all those things in order to get people in and keep them in housing. And so the way that we deal with that is we put people in housing and then use that as a place to help address their other needs, because a lot of those needs just aren't addressable when they're living on the street. It's essentially impossible if you wanted to, for instance, quit an addiction while you're living on the street. It's a really difficult thing to deal with. And so these kinds of housing first programs with supportive housing actually have been really successful. And what we've seen based on studies, actually the organization I used to work with, Denver Homeless Out Loud, has done a large number of surveys, and people say that they will not move into a shelter, right? But they will move into supportive housing if it's offered to them. These people want, that's what they want to go to, and the problem is that that's not being offered to them, right? Their only option that they're being offered is a congregate shelter.
So are you suggesting 100%, 50%, 25%?
Of the population?
What are the numbers?
Of the population?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need to house 100% of those people, absolutely. In terms of what number of that would be successful, I believe it's around 80 to 90.
Dolan, did you have a question?
Yeah, Crystal, I really appreciate the amendment to the camping ban that was passed, your amendment, the Murillo amendment. So I was wondering if you could tell us what the Murillo amendment was. But also, I kind of misunderstood. Also, Kaufman had an amendment at the end of the last regular meeting where the camping ban passed. And my understanding was that amendment was to decriminalize the camping ban. I may have misunderstood it. But can you describe to us what the Kaufman amendment was and what your amendment passed, the Murillo amendment passed? Kaufman's amendment didn't pass, but I actually liked Kaufman's amendment because I thought it was a way of decriminalizing it. So he basically said you won't be arrested no matter what.
Yeah,
Okay.
Okay, so we've discussed this camping ban twice. It'll go for a third reading on Monday. You all are welcome to come speak for and against. We start at 6:30. And essentially, so I saw some structural issues. Not only am I just don't agree that's good policy. The way it's written, again, there was no money. Like nobody in that law and ordinance, there was no description of how many of your taxpayer dollars were going to be used to implement that. I think that's a problem. So what I did is I requested an annual review of the policy. So I want to know how much it costs to implement this in Denver. It's in the millions. They're a larger city, but Denver also doesn't accurately necessarily track housing, the cost to implement this ban. I know because I've asked for the data and have gotten guesses because they don't have the best way, right? We talk about bureaucracy, right? Like there's different ways that each department is impacted and maybe not the best way to account for those costs. So I think that we should be transparent about how much it's going to cost. So I got an amendment to implement a annual review specifically looking at the impacts of the camping ban and the costs. So it'll take some time before we actually have that data, quite frankly, but we weren't gonna get the cost before it passed. So I felt like the best I could do in that situation was to do that. The other amendment that I think you might be talking about, Dolan, is the people's storage, like property storage. So, you know, if you think about it, if you're homeless, perhaps everything you own in this entire world is with you. And there was nothing in the ordinance that guaranteed that we were going to have a process to address what people own. And there's different like situations, right? Like, is it unintended property? Are you there when it happens? Are you not there? Et cetera, et cetera. And so the other amendment I passed was to develop a policy. City Council still has to approve that policy, so it's not finalized, right? So that's the other amendment I passed. And then Dolan, the way that this narrative has been discussed about the camping ban is that, oh, it's a camping ban, but it's humane. I don't think any camping ban is humane. And so the amendment that the mayor was trying to push was to, in writing, not fine people for homelessness, right? So that was kind of already written in there, but it was clarifying language, so it was unnecessary in my opinion. But second, I think it's misleading because you might not get charged specifically for cited for camping, but you will get cited for potentially other, and I'm not making an assumption about what's gonna happen when a camp is abated, but you might be cited for something else.
I will verify, this is what happens typically in Denver. The camping ban isn't typically enforced technically, right? People don't necessarily receive those citations. Instead, it's simply used as a kind of a threat to displace people, and then a lot of the times they lose property in that process, and a lot of times they get arrested in that process for other things.
And then I think, Wren, you mentioned, like, if they get cited for something other than just the citing for camping, maybe it's trespassing, I don't know what the charge would be, right? That might be a question for our officers. But down the line, when they don't show up for a court date because it was already difficult for them to access services, then that triggers involvement in our criminal legal system. So that is kind of the high level bit.
So under the Coven Amendment, they still could have been arrested if they didn't show up to their court date?
Yeah,
Okay.
like he was saying for the sweep, you wouldn't have gotten a fine, just specifically that, but anything else.
But you're saying that language was already in the
it was kind of
ordinance?
there. I think he was adding some clarifying. You think he was trying to make a point to say that it was very ethical and like humane. So I didn't agree that it was necessary, and I didn't agree that was true in my opinion. So I didn't agree with that. So I didn't vote for it. Yes,
Can I just add some other things? Because I have spoken to the unhoused. Some of them have had their IDs, veteran, their social security cards, their whatever Colorado ID stolen or lost, and it's a pain, trying to get your identity back. For a person that does not have a home is another issue. Sheltering, the shelters, they're only open on a limited basis, and they separate families, they separate males and females, they separate, and if you have a mobility issue, what basically these shelters have are mats on the floor. If you have a mobility issue, they cannot go up and down. And they're not exactly wheelchair accessible or walker accessible. Yeah. They don't allow belongings, they don't allow animals. So that's another issue.
yeah.
So reinforcing the road to housing really is getting to the root causes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's what it needs to happen.
Yeah.
Is to, get them the stability that they need,
Yeah.
or have to have veteran services if that's what they need.
Yeah.
if they need, just a place to call their address, so, because some of them are working.
Yeah.
They work from their car, they live in their car, but they can't afford a roof.
Yeah.
I mean.
We do have a lot of working poor, yeah, 100%.
So,
Um,
I mean, really drilling down and addressing the root causes is the path to doing it.
I would agree with you. I understand not everyone is on alignment, but I felt like it was worth a discussion to have a really frank conversation. Again, I don't want to minimize the fears, the misunderstandings, the concerns that you all may or may not share, right? Like, I'm not gonna make an assumption, but I just felt like it was an appropriate conversation to like really like talk to somebody who has researched this, who has participated on like a service level supporting folks, who's been like on the ground level, to kind of give you guys a glimpse of what the unintended consequences are about a serious policy like that, right? And I wanted to share kind of where I stand so that you all are aware of, you know, where I'm coming from in that vote. And then I think there's a question over here.
Yeah, more of a statement as well too, is this like, my name is Alex Luna, I'm the organizing director with United for a New Economy, and I work with a lot of families like right now that are in a constant fear right now of one paycheck away of facing eviction. And like also to be real is like looking at this camping ban is, for me, it's looking at it as a way of a cop-out to actually looking at deeper solutions, as you named, Councilwoman, for deeper solutions to problems that are currently existing right now at this very moment. That right now that the cost of living is rising up tremendously, and folks right now are being forced out of their homes and being pushed into the streets, the cars, the shelters. And the way that we're choosing to treat folks when we have the resources to support folks is that we're going to create a camping ban instead of how do we give city and municipalities more power and more tools to pass more affordable housing, to be able to pass putting caps and limits to how rent is increased right now. Because right now in 4 apartment complexes right now, there are folks that have received rent increases without their 60-day notification, that have received a rent increase in the middle of their lease, and are paying horrible fines, which is illegal.
But they do it anyway.
They
Yeah.
cannot do that.
Yeah.
No, it is illegal, but they do it
Doesn't
anyway.
matter
I've
that it's
seen it.
illegal, they do it.
Yeah.
And part of the piece that I'm naming this because like there's prohibition bans on like creating rent stabilization that prevent our local municipalities and us be able to co-govern.
Yeah.
And so part of this is like, Councilwoman, is like, how do we make sure that we implement really clear housing strategies to making sure that we are able to put prevention for folks actually being able to enter this process, and also wraparound services to making sure that folks don't enter the criminal justice system as well too, because of the situation that's been created by corporate greed.
Yeah, I see your hand. And I know I want to wrap up this conversation, so I'll let you say some words, but
Okay.
I think, city council, before I was elected and as I was running, I learned the power that city council has to implement like housing policies. Like, I didn't realize that city council could require a developer to incorporate affordable units in their brand new development, right? I didn't realize that was a tool that people could use. And that's a conversation I think that's gonna be evolving. Our housing strategy was working towards addressing some of these things. Like, it wasn't a specific recommendation of like one policy or another, but a suite of recommendations of, how do we increase the supply? How do we create partnerships with other groups to be able to address these things? So we can do more work, but it requires a city council that is willing to, like, a plan's only as good as a plan. If you're not putting any money into it and diverting it to a camping ban, let's say, right, you're not gonna get the output that you're looking for in that. So that's my answer there, Alex. And then, did you wanna say something?
Yeah, but there's a solution here.
Tell me.
And as a landlord, you cannot
take 170% property increase hit from the county, and which then increases your insurance another 170%. Plus the deductibles become 1% of the value of the property, because if you can get insurance in the Ward 1 at all. So what we need to do is the solution to this is very simple. You have all the cities go down and lobby at the state capitol that we pay tax on what we paid for the property.
Oh, so like, you're talking about the increased assessed value?
Right.
Yeah.
This has got to stop, because what's happening is people on Social Security have to get a reverse mortgage to pay their property tax. And it's getting out of hand, because and now we have people on the street that are older Americans that don't deserve that kind of a treatment. And I agree with you guys 100%, but the solution is being caused by the county's property tax and the increases in insurance, and it's just, it's gotten out of hand.
You and I have had conversations. I think your property taxes went up
170%.
Yeah, so it's complicated.
And that's on an 8-unit apartment building, so what do you have to do? You have to raise the rent.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna, I don't think that's the only thing to address.
That is a major problem.
But it is, right? And that's not something that city council controls, right? That's a county function.
Yeah, and the city has to interface with the county and tell them to knock it off.
I wish they would listen to me like that. There's always the question of, should we become a city and county? So
Yes, we should.
Hey, he said I didn't, but I don't want to open that can of worms, because I did want to give our city manager some time to give some updates. So I hope you all felt that this was like a conversation. You guys could ask the questions that you wanted. Maybe we don't agree, and that's okay. But again, this is important. I think we're dealing with people's lives, and to think about this in a that isn't nuanced, that people don't have a broad range of concerns or solutions, you know, would be not accurate. But I share with you kind of the ways I've tried to address this proactively, you know, in terms of how to minimize the negative impacts of the camping ban. I've shared the amendments that I've passed, so I hope that that was a dialogue that you all learn something, gain something from, and I'm gonna close discussion just because, again, I wanna give time to our city manager and potentially our police and fire representatives to give some updates at the end. But again, Wren, thank you so much for being here. I very much appreciate it. All right, I'm gonna invite Jim, our city manager. If you all were here earlier, there was a person who was talking about, well, don't we have a city manager? You know, why do we have a mayor? Which is kind of a joke, but you know, our city manager is essentially the CEO of the city. That's our structure of government. He and I are here to serve, you know, your needs. And I invited him here. It's been a little while. I think he joined one of our first town halls when he first started. But I figured it was due time for an update. So I will let you kind of give some broad updates. Please feel free to have a dialogue, a conversation with him. If you want to direct any questions to me, I'm definitely willing to participate as well. But otherwise, I will hand it over. Thanks, Jim.
Great. Jim Twombly, City Manager. Nice to be here. Glad to see everyone. It's a good turnout. I want to start by talking a little bit about the area that we're in here. And it ties in with the kind of the homelessness issue in some ways, in that, you know, during the pandemic, with a lot of businesses closed and this building closed and other city facilities, and then also at that time, around that time, there was there was a lot of camping going on downtown Denver. When Denver broke that up, we found that there was people displaced from that area that ended up in this area and some other areas in Aurora. And now there was, among shop owners and our folks here at MLK and Fox Theater and so on, there was an uptick in basis now, and we review progress of things that we're trying to accomplish in the area, and then we report out to the stakeholder group what's going on with that. And so we had a meeting last Friday, our monthly meeting, and I just wanted to we touched on a lot of things that I wanted to just let you know about what we're doing to try to address some of the issues. And so I'm just going to go down the list of what different departments are addressing here. So our Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Department, another thing Councilmember Murillo did, I believe it was in a budget workshop last year, was kind of lobbied for the city to take on a regular power washing responsibility within the area. And so what we did is we purchased a utility vehicle where you can have a mounted power washer and do regular power washing in the alleys and curbs and the different public areas. And so we took delivery on the utility truck, and we're getting the power washer mounted on it, and we're gonna use what's called Ready to Work group. There's a Ready to Work program. Their housing is located down in South Peoria and Parker. And right now, the city, we contract with them for about $250,000 a year in help within the Parks and Recreation Department with like landscaping, mowing, wintertime snow shoveling and clearing, that sort of thing. And they're going to take on this responsibility of power washing also. So we'll increase that contract by some so that we can have power washing in the area on a regular, frequent basis. So that will really help. The other thing that the Parks is doing is looking at the big blue chair area where we have a lot of people that congregate there. We try to go grass. The grass doesn't work. It's nice because there are a few trees there, so there's shade in the hot summertime. But we're looking at what we can do to make that more inviting for everybody to share in terms of that space. So on that one, there will be some outreach, I think, to businesses in the area that the Parks and Recreation people will do to get some ideas about how to sort of enhance that space. Our Housing and Community Services Department, there is just west of here a little duplex that used to be a Little Flower Catholic Charities that's been vacant for I don't know how long, but a long time. And we haven't known really what to do with that. It's in very poor repair. The Housing Authority has, of course, the complex just to the south of there, and we've been working with them. And just as coincidence, our Aurora Water is going to be doing a sewer line work that's going to necessitate the demolition of that the duplex. So that will be demolished probably sometime this summer. And what we'd like to do then is work with the Housing Authority and the community to talk about what we can do with that property. It could be additional housing, it could be open space, it could be parking, but we want to get community input there on what's the best use of that land. It's not a big piece of property, but between that and what the Housing Authority owns that's also vacant, we could do something really nice there. Also, we do have a neighborhood improvement grant program that the application period goes through mid-April, and that is through the Housing and Community Services Department. And those neighborhoods can apply for small grants for beautification type neighborhood branding and logos or signs and things like that. So that grant is still for about another 3 weeks, I think, available. Then also, some of you may have seen the Aurora Mobile Response Team in the area. They have a kind of a big white panel van, and they focus on Northwest Aurora, and it's really kind of a behavioral health, mental health response team that responds to calls that come into 911 as an alternative to police. And so the idea of, on the one piece of it is to free up police to do, to fight crime. And to send the team as a paramedic and a mental health clinician, a social worker, and what they try to do is connect people that it may be welfare checks, it may be suicide ideation, it may be it may be public intoxication, or just people kind of acting out. Well, they can come and they can make an assessment, work with people to see if they can get them to serve appropriate services where they can get some help. And it's, like I said, it's not really a policing or a fire function. I know I've heard stories of police and fire responding to a public intoxication with, a fire truck and several police cars, and we don't need to do that 99% of the time. And the other thing is they have police radios. If something escalates, if they need assistance from the police or from fire, another paramedic perhaps, they can call them out and get them there immediately. So it's an alternative. We have just finished our first 6 months of pilot program. We have funding for another 6 months this year, and we have a budget amendment coming up, what we call a spring supplemental, where we'll be asking for the council to provide funding for the balance of 2022. And then for 2023, we'll be going to council and trying to expand probably the program hours and the program geography. Like I said, right now it's just Northwest Aurora, because what we did is we looked at what we call a heat map of where these types of calls, the majority of these types of calls were coming from. And a lot of them were coming from the Northwest Aurora area. And so that's where we put the immediate, resources. So then we also, from a police standpoint, you will, I think in a May, June timeframe, begin to see officers on bikes again. There won't be the full patrol like you've had in the past, but we will, from time to time, deploy officers on bikes. So that's a real good thing too. We're really happy to hear about that. And then we also, and I'll get to this other one in connection with something else. And then our development services, which is part of the planning department, they've worked a lot with business owners to try to get like restaurants and other stores in the area. Some of their successes are like Baba and Pops, and Third Culture Bakery was a success, but we have another business that's going in there. And there were a couple other restaurants up on, I think, Montview. Yeah. So they continue to work in here, and like I said, they've worked with building owners on finding new tenants for the Third Culture Bakery space. And then we're also working down the street here, Cerebral Brewing, that's going to be going in. The 1400 Dallas building has been renovated, and we'll have tenants moving in there again soon. And then they're also looking at ways to activate Fletcher Plaza and the green space out here, talking about things like, again, summer movies and perhaps, performances, that sort of thing. So we're looking at ways that we can get a lot more activity out here. So those are the things that came out of the interdepartmental meeting from last Friday. And we'll also, Councilmember Murillo will we'll probably schedule another of the stakeholder meetings. They've been virtual so far. We might be able to actually hold one in person.
That'd be nice.
It would be nice. And so when we do have the next one, we'll certainly advertise it and get the word out so that as many of you as possible can attend and just see that interaction. You'd be able to, communicate the issues, things that are on your mind, and hear what's on this stakeholder group. I think the stakeholder group probably has about 40 or 50 that have attended in the past, so good turnout of those too.
And it's a mix of like businesses, just residents, property owners, like it's not one, so like,
Nonprofits,
yeah,
yeah.
nonprofits, so it really is open to all of you all. And I guess just the one thing to like, mention there is, that those were some really good updates. I think why that was a really important like stakeholder group is normally when you guys have an issue, you call me or you submit it to Access Aurora and I submit a request and I say, can you talk to this person? Can you address this issue? So it's very reactive, right? And that's kind of just the nature of the things, right? You don't know what's gonna happen, but when it does, you submit a request. But so what we tried to do is really be proactive about kind of some emerging themes or issues that kind of are reoccurring so that we could be proactive and work with the necessary departments, right? Because one issue might involve like 5 different departments without you all realizing it, right? So trying to be proactive, having a lead in each department, having a monthly meeting, having the buy-in of like our CEO to proactively address these issues. So, I think that's something I wanted to highlight, right? Like we're trying to be proactive and be a little bit different than just business as usual. And I think we've produced some good results. As a result of this, the stakeholder group, we had the foot patrols along the Colfax corridor that are from our police department. Their goal is to build relationships with the businesses, relationships with perhaps folks who are experiencing homelessness or just people, residents in the area, right? Like trying to have not always like a negative interface with our police department. It is the concept of community policing, right? That we all have a role in the safety of our community. So that was a result of that. We also, that power washer, right, to like deal with, the cleanliness of a particular area, graffiti, for example. And then there was a grant, a pedestrian safety grant that we were able to, we invested $400,000 of city dollars and we were able to get a $2 million investment. So we were able to proactively leverage a small amount of money, less than half, to get $2 million total from the state to improve pedestrian safety, right? So, it's a lot of like internal, like, you might not like see those people, they're not gonna be the elected officials talking to you or the city staff for your building permit or et cetera, but I think it's really important because it was a really proactive effort. It's ongoing. I encourage you all, if you're here, to go to those meetings as well, because we did take seriously the input and the needs that you all share there.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize that proactive and ongoing, because when we had that first meeting in January of 2021, probably every other statement was kind of a, well, here we go again. We're going to have a meeting. We're going to tell everybody about what the issues are, and that'll be the end of it. And so we made that commitment at the time. This is not the end of it. This is ongoing, and it has been ongoing. So the city, have a really strong commitment to the area, to Northwest Aurora, and we're going to see it through.
Yeah, I think there was a question over here first.
Yeah. Jim, can you give us an update on what's going on with 1400 Dallas Street, the former ACAD building there?
Yeah, that's the one that has been renovated now, and moved everybody out, renovated, and the commitment was that the tenants that were in there would have first opportunity to come back in.
So it remains a cultural arts
Yes.
facility?
Yes. We will, and we're doing something different with the management of the building, and I'm sorry I can't say exactly what it is, but we feel like we need stronger management of the building.
So it's like the 1400 Dallas building is like a artist space, right? Like where we can hold events. This is the Aurora Cultural Arts District, this part of Aurora, like along Colfax in this area. So it was a city-owned building, and the intention is to provide like affordable spaces for businesses who like are in the arts, to have like business space, to have space like gallery space or just open space to like convene, because it's expensive, right, to like own your own building and have to maintain that individually. So the thought was we could support and offer all of these great amenities, right, to folks at a more effective like cost. And I'm excited for the renovations. I was a little nervous when that was proposed because my thing is I didn't want to displace any of our existing artists, right? Our tenants, like they need a space to be. So we were able to get the commitment that like they would have the right to rejoin once that space was renovated. And I know they've worked with, our city staff has worked with the tenants to try to rehome them in the meantime. So, not everything's perfect or by any means. And it's like one project out of many that the city is doing to support cultural arts and activity and just people being around and like all these great things in the district. So, yes.
Yeah, I have a question about signage that went up about 3 months ago, and it's these no parking signs, and now they're putting them all over the neighborhood in Ward 1. I've got one right in the middle of my apartment building that took away half the parking on the street. And then they did it over by my house too.
I'd have to
And I
see
have
what we can
called,
find out about that.
I have called Aurora Access, and then they put me into the signage, and then they were gonna get back to me, and I've talked to 3 people, and nobody can tell me why those things went up.
Okay, we'll find that out.
Yeah,
We'll get it to
well-
Councilmember Murillo and,
We'll have to address that, yeah.
yeah.
I think Alan was in the back and then
Okay, so FRA money, how much of that is going to housing? How much of that is going to Ward 1? How much of that is going to possibly the rapid response project?
Yeah, I don't believe any of it's going towards housing. The rest, I'm not sure what they're doing with it. It's a separate authority that, believe we have mayor and 2 or 3 council members that are on that authority. They are independent of the city, but created by the city.
Okay, so what is the guarantee that it's not going to Ward 6?
that it's not going to what?
Ward
All
6.
to Ward 6?
Oh, so, I mean, I don't know if I have a great answer, but I'll tell you, so Ellen is asking about the Fitzsimmons Redevelopment
No, no, no.
Authority.
The federal recovery money.
Oh, ARPA?
Oh.
ARPA? Oh, well, we have some updates on ARPA. Sorry, I misunderstood your question, so.
Yeah.
I know you said
That fits in, that's a whole nother animal.
Yeah.
That's a whole other animal,
Yeah.
and I'm.
So, yeah, the ARPA dollars, so we've had a few tranches infusion of federal dollars that are meant to assist communities with COVID redevelopment and, or not redevelopment, recovery. And there's a broad range of ways that we've implemented that money. I will lean on Jim to talk about some of the other things, but things that you all should be aware of. We actually have some community grants. We've allocated a couple million in a few different areas, like small business grants. There was 2 other ones that passed as well.
I'll go down the list.
And I will pass it on to Jim.
So, the grants, we have a $3 million safety and security grant, of which $500,000 is to be spent in the Colfax corridor.
So if you have a business or anything, there's criteria, but if anything related to safety, security, for businesses, nonprofits, it's not just tax-paying businesses, anybody along the Colfax corridor could apply for that safety and security grants.
Well, what is the Colfax corridor?
For this grant, it will be Yosemite to Peoria,
Along-
and
Oh.
16th
Yes.
to 14th. So just that
Yeah.
exact corridor.
And did you get a grant from the Dieselgate? Did you get any part of that?
From what?
Dieselgate?
Dieselgate, where they had to give $200 million to the local economies around the country because of air pollution.
Well,
There was
it
a
has come
bunch
to
of
the
money.
city.
Yeah, it's supposed to.
Well, it hasn't. We could look into that, but yeah, we haven't received anything like that. And we also have a $3 million behavioral health grants for agencies that provide assistance with behavioral health. 2.5 million for small business assistance grants, 2.5 million for nonprofits, and then a $2 million restaurant grant, $2 million in restaurant grants. So that's some of the ARPA money. There is $5 million set aside for housing. And then there were various other, we did push out some funding early on. We built it into the 2022 budget. There's kind of a laundry list of things there. $7 million for Aurora Mental Health for their new campus, where they will have detox, where they'll have emergency mental health services and supportive housing. So those are some of the important ones, I guess.
Okay, I'm gonna play Asian advocate here, because less than 1% of funding from not only philanthropical funds or sources, but also government funds is allotted to Asian issues. How much of that is going to be allotted to Asian issues?
There's nothing specifically allotted from that money for Asian issues. Asians will certainly benefit from the
No.
different uses of those
No,
funds.
no.
Well-
How much of it is going to be allotted for Asian-related issues like housing and small businesses and mental health, and especially with the Asian hate that has been going on? And it has happened in Aurora. I have been the victim of Asian
Yes.
hate.
Yeah.
So, and for me, it is also generational.
Yeah.
So how much of that money is going to be allotted to Asian resource money?
The same as what I said before. None of it has been.
That's not acceptable.
Okay.
Ellen, I think,
That is not acceptable.
Does any of it go to the Asian Community Center down off of,
they can apply for that nonprofit grant, but I'll tell you, look, so you make a good point. I hear you, Ellen, in terms of who, like, we have all this money and like, maybe you all like are like, okay, but I never see any of it, right? And I think that's a fair point. Like, what are the demographics of folks that actually end up receiving these dollars? Yeah, we tend to see that like marginalized communities don't tend to be the recipients of some of this grant money. So I think we're gonna have to be really careful and really proactive, like, sharing folks these different resources to apply to. Often what I hear from groups that I know are doing really good work is that they're so small of an organization that they've never had a grant writer, right? They don't know how to like navigate, they don't know how to apply for the funding, right? It's not that they wouldn't, it's just they don't necessarily have that capacity. So, I think the conversation of can the city support with those types of services? I know that's not gonna fully address your issues. We're not gonna be able to resolve that in this conversation, Ellen, but I would love to follow up with you because we should be keeping track of demographics, who are the past recipients, how are we being equitable? I will say, when we were doing that business security grant, I asked for hey, how is this gonna be implemented? Is this gonna be equitable? Are we gonna consider different demographics? And the resolution was that it's first come, first served. So I don't agree with that, but that is how it passed, that particular one. But Ellen, I'm gonna move us forward. We don't have that much time, but I definitely wanna follow up. I hear you.
No, because people need to hear this.
Of
The
course.
Asian businesses were hit the hardest. Housing, they were hit the hardest. Many of them are low-wage earners. They've been hurt at wage lows. The first death in Colorado was a Burmese person in the Montfort meatpacking.
Yeah.
What news? I mean, her family is still hurting from it.
Yeah.
So we have been impacted greatly.
Yep.
And it's not our fault.
I agree.
And as I said, for me, it is generational.
Yeah.
And we need to stop it. We need to stop this.
Ellen, I don't mean to, I think you should be as loud as you want, right, when it comes to advocating, because I don't disagree. I think, if you ask my opinion of a structural level, I'm telling you how these specific programs have worked, ways we can improve, but I think on a higher level, policies that might help address that is, one thing that comes to mind is like an equity plan, right? Like how we don't currently, like at a holistic level, like individual departments might like keep good demographics and have goals towards, you know, funding to support an outcome here, but I think a larger equity plan might be a good direction, but that's gonna take a long time, frankly. I think there was another question or comment over here, yeah.
As far as the grants, are they currently active and open for applications, or are they coming?
Coming. We'll be pushing them out probably early in April, and we'll have lots of social media and on city website
Yeah.
abilities to learn about those.
Ken?
This is a more of a high-level question. I'm hearing a lot about city services, both for homeless as well as various other ones, and many of them are subcontracted. Housing vouchers often go to motels, Salvation Army that controls the pallet shelters, if I recall correctly, and a lot of other RFPs that are being brought out. Out of curiosity, just spitballing here, what do you see as potential challenges, either politically, fiscally, whatnot, to potentially bring these services back in-house and have them being controlled by city employees?
Well, the reason we do that is because there are nonprofits out there already doing these things. And, you know, they've been doing it for years. They have the capacity and the personnel to be able to handle those things. For us to be able to take on this type of thing that Mile High Behavioral Health does, or Salvation Army, or Rural Mental Health, that's really not in our, I mean, we would have to gear up so much to be able to take on those types of services. We have contract administrators, so we have people that oversee those contracts to make sure that they're fulfilling the contracts as written, as we have doing the things we're requiring them to do. And we do, you know, site visits and make sure that they're working. And so that's what we feel like we can do. Be able to actually take those services in-house. I mean, the staff up, the building construction and so on, or buying properties would just be more than we could handle. And the other thing is they can handle it. A lot of these agencies are handling these metro-wide, so they have a lot of good experience in how to do that.
So I guess the short answer is like, it doesn't make fiscal sense for us at this point. You could point to Denver, who's a city and county. They have different resources, different like population size. They have a different scope of what they're able to do. So the hypothetical question is like, you know, and we would, if we ever explored the idea of a city and county, it would be that cost benefit. There's like a formal like fiscal investigation, cost benefit analysis before we did that. Our late Mayor Hogan really was pushing for a city and county. And I think there was a study in 2013 exploring that, but that would be my other addition is like, you know, whatever Jim was saying, it's not fiscally feasible now. I wonder if it would be as a city and county. Yeah.
This question is for Jim, City Manager Jim Twombly. Jim, so the city of Denver is a mayor-powered city, and the city of Aurora is city manager-powered. You are the city manager. Can you explain to us what kind of influence you have in the agenda with committee meetings? And hopefully at some point we can have the committee meetings on YouTube and on the city's website. A lot of other cities and towns across the country do that, including my hometown, West Hartford, Connecticut, which is a very small town. And I know that the city of Aurora is very well managed financially. I would think that we have the resources to get those committee meetings on YouTube and the city website. So I want to know your influence, power, because it is a city manager powered city, so I would assume the power is somewhat centralized in your hands. So I want to know, like, what kind of influence you have on the agenda and the committee meetings, but also in the study sessions and the regular meetings. And do you sit down with the mayor to figure out what the agenda is? What kind of, do you guys have meetings beforehand with the city council members as to what the agenda is going to be, and how are the lawyers involved in all this? What's going on behind the scenes?
Sure. So I wouldn't call it city manager power, because It's more city manager operational. So the way that the system works is that there are the policy committee meetings where generally there are operational things that come to policy committee meetings, and then there are also policies brought forth by council members that generate different ideas, thoughts, things that they want to accomplish. So both of those types of things come to policy committee meetings. And from the policy committee, we'll go to study session. Policy, there's 3 members of each policy committee. They will decide whether something advances to a study session. At study session, the full council hears about the policy or operational changes or financial issues or, recommendations. At study session, the council members will decide, is this something that should appear on a council agenda for formal approval, whether it's a resolution, an ordinance, a contract, so on. And so that's how they get to the city council meeting where formal action is taken. Most of the contracts that appear on a council agenda are really just operational contracts. They might be procurement, they might be professional services, engineering, planning, and so on. Those are all staff generated. Driven policy, which was actually, it was eliminating a fee, a license and fee that had been required. It was on the books, but hadn't been used in years. So staff, realizing that, brought it forward to policy committee, to study session, and to council. So those are the types of things that would be staff initiated. Otherwise, we're supporting council's policy-making process.
So who's actually writing the resolutions, ordinances, amendments, all this stuff?
Those that come out of the city attorney's office.
Okay. And then they work with the council members to write?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And
Are you
staff.
involved with that and the mayor at all, or
Pardon me?
are you involved with that at all, with the mayor? In crafting law? Like the actual
Well,
text?
We provide a lot of the research, the background that goes into how those resolutions and ordinances are written and crafted.
And what about the committee meetings? When can we see that fired up on YouTube and the city's website? Since I know that this is one of the best financially managed cities in the country,
Let's check
I would think that
it.
that could be done pretty easily.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm doing this right now with very little cost, so.
Right. And that's something we have expanded with the pandemic. We are equipping different sites for town hall meetings like this so that they can be virtual, hybrid. You can participate from your couch or from your chair in the room. So we need to look into expanding that to committee meetings also.
And Dolan, you might have some follow-up, but we're at time, so I'm gonna ask you to continue this conversation outside. But we do, each ward has one like hybrid facility. The ward, the facility here is in Moorhead, so when we have our Moorhead meetings, we try to rotate Moorhead, MLK every other month. I'm gonna try and get those to be hybrid, just as an FYI. And then you had a question, Nadine, and then I do wanna open up to any other announcements, and then any last minute thoughts before we wrap up. Go ahead.
This has all been very informative, and I'm sure we all appreciate it very much, but I had thought that we were going to have the police and fire folks speaking tonight as well. Is it possible to have that at another time, since we are out of time?
See, yes, and so generally the way our meetings are run is I have some time in the beginning for our police and fire representatives. Unfortunately, they weren't here at that time. So logistically, that kind of put things behind. They are here now. I will open it up to the floor for some announcements. You're welcome to connect with them afterwards. So yes, short answer is yes, but unfortunately, the structure of the meeting didn't